Hi everybody. So I just wanted to go through some stuff from the study guide because if you can believe it, we're almost at the final exam. Basically, we've got that coming up on Tuesday, and then you guys will have one more day to work on your papers and submit them into me. And yeah, basically we're at the end of the class. It's been a good journey, done a lot of cool stuff, but I wanted to take a look at the study guide here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of the topics on this study guide. A lot of this is going to look familiar because one of the sections here is review. But I think I am just rearranging there. I think I'm going to just go through a handful of these just to give you some guys some idea and kind of get you started. And we'll also have the discussion section where you guys can also brainstorm more of these. So basically, the discussion for this week is going to be brainstorming the different topics here. So your goal for the discussion will be to pick one of these points, maybe more than one, and respond to them and just kind of give your own answer, and we'll brainstorm some ideas together. So I'll do some, and then maybe you want to do different ones. I don't know, but let's go through and take a look. Okay, so our first section here is the review from the midterm. So some stuff is going to be familiar, and then let's go and we'll touch on that briefly, and then after that is going to be content that we looked at in the second half of this class. So let's see. Let's just take a look at. Let me just pick one of the ones from section 1 review section here. So how the Jews sought to refute Babylonian creation ideas. I think that's one of the harder ones. You might remember it from the test or you might not, but basically the Jews were captive exiles in Babylon, right? So the Babylonian captivity, the Jews had been exiled, their temple had been burned down, and they were forced to live in Babylon. So here they were surrounded by people who didn't believe in the same things as them and kind of a minority. So they were used to hearing the Babylonian creation myth, and they decided to respond with the creation myth of their own, right? So this is going back to the book of Genesis, the Bible. And the book of Genesis basically evokes all the same sort of water-related imagery as the Babylonian creation myth does, with water and rivers and whatnot. But the Jewish creation myth basically says that God used the waters to create the world. God created the world out of the waters. Whereas in the Babylonian creation myth, it's Tiamat and Apsu create the world, and then Marduk creates the world out of them. So it's sort of a shift of focus, and basically is the Jews saying, no, your God didn't do that. Our God created that, and your multiple gods didn't do that. Our single God did that. So basically, it's a refutation of that. And the reason why they wanted to refute it is because they were living during the Babylonian exile. Okay, let's look at Vladimir Prop. So actually, let's see. So what are some of the major functions? So functions is a bit overwhelming. You don't have to remember them all. But if we were to say, what is an interdiction? So an interdiction is a commandment that you're not supposed to do. Someone tells you don't do something. And that's quite frequently something that happens in the prologue of a fairy tale, what Prop calls the preparatory part of the fairy tale. And he gives that the Greek letter. I believe that is epsilon. Just a second, let me check here. Oop. Actually, let's see. Can y'all see that here? And see here. Okay, so it's gamma. Interdiction is gamma, and then the violation of the interdiction is delta. So I would not say you have to remember all of these, but there's some important concepts we talked about, like the interdiction. And in the main story, I would say some of the most important ones are the harm or the lack, the donor, the return, the difficult task and the solution to the difficult task, the punishment of the villain, and the wedding. Oh, and of course the resolution of harm or lack. Okay, so let's go through those one by one real quick here. Let's see here. Yes, okay, we're still rolling. Sorry, guys, technical difficulties. Okay, so So a lot of the stuff Prop mentions, all the Greek letters are for the prologue stuff. So the interdiction is usually a part of the prologue. And it doesn't happen in every story, but where someone is told not to do something and then that commandment is violated is often part of the prologue of the story. But the sort of reason for the story is in the harm or the lack. So the harm is big letter A, also listed here as villainy. This is something that the villain does to harm the hero. And this is the problem that is at the beginning of the story that the hero sets out to solve. Whereas the lack is the same thing, a problem that the hero sets out to solve, but it is not caused by the villain specifically. So I actually don't agree with what it says here. Okay, well, yeah, no, based on what the book says, the harm is something specifically caused by the villain, and the lack is something that is missing in the hero's life but is not specifically caused by the villain. Then very often the hero leaves home. That's represented by an upward arrow. The donor, you can remember for D for donor. So the donor sequence comes in 3 parts. So you meet the donor, that's letter D. The hero is tested by the donor, that's letter E. So the hero has to overcome some challenge that the donor sets upon him. This can take place a lot of different ways. The donor may, have a riddle that the hero has to solve or have to be defeated in a fight. Or maybe the donor doesn't even want to be a donor and it's just like a thief that the hero beats up and takes the stuff that the thief stole, as happened in the Raven Girl. So that's letter E, and then letter F is the donor's gift. So the hero gets a magical gift or a tool or some sort of sage advice that helps them overcome their problems and win in their quest. Okay, then we've got letter K. Letter K is solving the original problem. That's an important one. We talked about how in Shrek, the original problem of fairy tale creatures in his swamp is solved, but that doesn't mean his story is over. So the original problem is solved, but that isn't actually the final victory of the hero. Downward arrow is the return of the hero to homeland, and this may sound familiar to Joseph Campbell. It's a similar thing, just a different way of talking about it. M is a difficult task that the hero is asked to do over the course of the journey. Not the same as the donor task because it's not given by the donor. This is something maybe a princess or the princess's father might give the hero a difficult task, and that's letter M. And letter N is solving the task. The Wizard of Oz gives Dorothy the task of getting the broomstick of the Wicked Witch of the West, and she does that. And then letter U is the punishment of the villain. And then letter W is the wedding. The hero achieves some kind of greater victory. Very frequently, this is in the form of marrying a princess or having a wedding. But it doesn't always have to be. In Dorothy's case, it's her going home. In Shrek's case, it's breaking up Lord Farquaad's wedding so he can have his own wedding. So that's pretty cool. Let's see. Okay, so that's a little quick glance at some prop stuff. Sorry to flash so much on here. It's a little weird to use this program sometimes. Okay, skipping from prop a little bit. Okay, we've got The Terrifying Levi Strauss, but I rolled them in with Carl Jung because we're not going to have as much about Levi Strauss on the test. But what is Levi Strauss's method for storytelling, for analyzing a myth? Well, basically, you divide all the events in the myth up into cards, and then you organize those cards into categories, which are columns. And the columns are different topics that come up in the myth. So you might have the topic of loving your family too much. You might have the topic of loving your family too little. And you might have the topic of monsters that come from the earth and damaged feet. And then Levi Strauss's next thing is to look for opposites. Clearly loving your family too much is a good opposite for murdering your family. And then he makes a sort of odd argument that people with damaged feet are humans who came out of the earth. And on the other hand, you've got monsters that come out of the earth. So those are opposites because one's good thing, humans coming out of the earth, and the other's a bad thing coming out of the earth, monsters. And you kill the monsters, but you praise the humans. And then Levi-Strauss says that the myth is about this tension between these opposites, that we feel anxious when we have these sort of controversies, when we have these opposites in our brains. And so he says we should look for a mediator. And he says the story is kind of a mediator because Oedipus is someone who experiences the disaster of both loving your family too much and loving your family too little. So he kind of involves both categories. But then the proper mediation is ordinary family life. And then the thing in between, there really isn't anything in between. Good things come from the earth and bad things come from the earth. So instead, we solve the other problem, and that makes us feel like we've solved both problems. It's a little weird, but you can kind of see how it works. Okay, let's see. How about Jung? Let's do a pretty simple one. What are the major archetypes of Jung? Okay, you've got the self, the ideal self, the animus, and the anima. And you've also got the shadow. The shadow is something that you've repressed in your brain, so it shows up in a dream or in a myth, like a monster, something frightening that you're afraid of. But if you recognize it, you can find out how it's useful to you, and you can find out what you haven't addressed, and you need to address to become mature as a person. Whereas the self, or ideal self, is the person you want to grow to be, represents your whole potential, you at your best self, and is usually represented by the figure of some kind of wise man, like Obi-Wan Kenobi or something like that. Now, Jung says that the shadow and the self are usually the same gender as the dreamer. So if you're a man, it will be Obi-Wan Kenobi. If you're a woman, it'll be like wise old woman, to have the ideal self. And the shadow and the and whatnot will be the same gender as you. We could say maybe we want to be skeptical of that, but that's his interpreting it in 1940. And then the animus and the anima are about interpreting things that aren't the same gender as you. So for a man, the anima figure, the feminine within, is a lot of things at the same time. It's the part of yourself that's feminine, that you might repress, and by having those qualities, you connect with the women in your life. So it's also the women that you are sort of romantically interested in. And it's got something to do with the relationship with your mother and sort of these feminine archetypes who have been powerful and important in your life. And for a woman, instead, she has the male within, the animus, these masculine qualities, her relationship with her father, and the kind of things that she finds interesting or significant in men. And I think Jareth from Labyrinth is a good animus figure that is both positive and negative, appealing but also frightening. Beauty and the Beast is another one where he's ugly at first, but then he becomes compelling over time. So you've got that going on too. So those are some things to know about those four big archetypes. You also have the persona, which is kind of just like any role you put on yourself, and is symbolized by things like masks. Let's see. Hero's Journey. We've talked a lot about this recently, but it might be good to go back and watch the videos on the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Ramayana. But what are some of the major stages of the hero's journey? Okay, we've got the departure, and we've got the return. Let's see. How do we phrase this? We've got crossing the first threshold, crossing the threshold. Well, it all starts off with the call of adventure. Something sort of interferes in your life that you don't know about, and sort of suggests this world of magic and adventure. So there's the two worlds. There's the ordinary world and the world of adventure. And then you've got the call of the hero saying something's wrong, a problem you need to solve, or something you need to do, or something just seems appealing. So you end up going to the world of adventure. And that's called crossing the threshold. You might need supernatural aid to get to the threshold, and sometimes you have a character who helps you across, or sometimes you get dragged across. It's not something you really intended. Now you can refuse the call and want to stay at home, but you'll find yourself getting dragged back in eventually. Not every story refuses the call. You don't have to refuse the call, but some people do. But they find themselves getting dragged back in anyway.